Well, hello, everyone. My name is Lan Davis Wilson, and I have the honor of serving the Diversity Missions and Justice Ministries in the Indiana Annual Conference. And we're here today to talk about just some of the diversity and justice related topics of work that was done at the most recent general conference, the postponed 2020 general conference that happened in 2024. And we've got just a couple of the delegates here with us that served the Indiana Conference and served on behalf of the Indiana Conference at General Conference in Charlotte. And I want to invite them to introduce themselves. And then we're going to get right into it. This is just, again, just an overview of some of the things that we've pulled from all of the thousand plus pieces of legislation that happened and that were discussed and voted on at General Conference. And so first, let's start with Mary-Kate Annin.
Hi, my name is MaryKate Annin. She, her pronouns. I live in the Lafayette area, and I was a reserve lay delegate to General Conference.
Thank you. And Mary-Kate also serves as one of the co-chairs of the Diversity Missions and Justice Ministries Board in the Indiana Conference. And next we got Nathan.
Hi there. My name is Nathan Lundy. I'm an attorney in Columbia City and was a seated lay delegate at the General Conference in Charlotte.
Thank you so much, Nathan. And Duane.
Hi, I'm Duane Carlisle. I am a clergy delegate. I serve First United Methodists in West Lafayette, so Mary-Kate and I are neighbors. Mary-Kate attends St. Andrews, which is also in West Lafayette. I have a couple other hats that I wear around our Indiana Conference work. I also chair our nominations committee. So if I come up and twist your arm at some point about serving on a committee like the Diversity Mission and Justice team, you'll know why. The work that DMJ does is really important. So thanks, Lynn, for hosting this.
Thank you so much, Duane, Nathan, Mary-Kate. Thank you so much for being with us. Today, we're going to talk again about just a few of the topics from the legislation that we've pulled out that we wanted to lift up, and I'm going to ask them to weigh in. Many of you have probably already seen or read or heard about some of the major work or the things that have made the headlines in our United Methodist News from General Conference, particularly around regionalization, which there's much more discussion to be had about how that's going to play out. Also, the removal of restrictive language related to LGBTQ persons. And so we celebrate all of the work that has been done around that, but we also understand that when there's headlines, other things sometimes get pushed to subtext, and we want to make sure that we give you a chance to just hear more about some of that incredible work that happened. If I'm right, you all, wasn't it about 1,019 pieces of legislation somewhere around there that we started out with that came to the General Conference floor? And so we want to just lift up a few of those, and I'm going to ask you all to weigh in. I volunteered as a page at conference. So I was literally just a bystander running around on the floor, but these folks were there in the committees, on the plenary floor, doing the work. And so I'm excited that you're here for these conversations. The things that we're discussing, I want you to know that they're of no order of priority. This is just, I'm going to run down the list of how we have things. And hopefully we've answered some of your questions, but feel free to reach out to the Diversity Missions and Justice office if you want to ask more questions about some of the work done, and you can certainly find that online as well. So first up, Mary-Kate works not only on our DMJ board, but also has worked tirelessly with our Compassion and Inclusion Ministry. And one of the pieces of legislation that passed was around Disability Awareness Sunday. Talk to us about that, Mary-Kate.
Sure. So Disability Awareness Sunday, which for our conference, for the Indiana Conference, will be happening on August 25th. So we will keep your eye out for information about that. Has been in the past under Global Ministries. It is now under the heading of GCOR, our Commission on Religion and Race. There were actually several disability pieces that can kind of fall under that education piece of that Disability Awareness Sunday can bring. And really it is kind of highlighting not only what was there, but has added several layers to what disability looks like, what is considered under the umbrella of disability. So say before, when we had grants for disability, it would have talked about removing architectural barriers. Now with some of the legislation that's passed, it has included not only grants for removal of architectural barriers, but communication barriers, sensory barriers, and then kind of a quote, other barriers to kind of leave it open. It also falls under spaces for seminary students to have accommodations. It just kind of expanded the umbrella, expanded that circle, made it wider, to have a barrier-free society.
Yes, legislation around helping people in the ordination process
Mhm.
and all of that. So I think that's really huge, and it's important that because we're constantly defining and expanding our definition and understanding in Indiana of how we look at diversity, and
Right.
we're really trying to embrace understanding that neurodiversity and being differently abled is a part of one of those markers of diversity and what makes us unique and the ways in which we can love on each other and see each other. So thank you.
Yep,
Uh,
there was, if I can add just a couple
yeah,
of things, there'll be more at annual conference that you'll see about that. We'll have a disability awareness, or disability advocacy table outside of plenary,
yes,
that kind of focuses on the neurodiversity sensory issues. But really just kind of under this idea, kind of to expand on what you just said, Lynn, that all groups, and I think this is partially why it goes up, what will be helpful of it being under G-Corps is that all groups, racial groups, ethnic groups, age-related groups, all of those groups include persons with disabilities. And so just kind of, so I think that's at least partially why it falling under G-Corps will be a positive thing for Disability Awareness Sunday.
yes. And another thing that we were grateful to accomplish was the added legislation around cultural competency training. If you've been in residence in ministry or licensed to preach school, or maybe in your district, you've experienced it, or in moving with the missional purpose, you've probably heard the term by now, Cultural Competency 101. It's okay if you haven't. It's a new training that we've been offering in the last year, and we're trying to work towards offering that in a broader way across the constituency of the annual conference. But legislation was successfully passed in consultation with G-Corps, that we are strongly now encouraging all of our annual conferences to provide cultural competency training. This piece of legislation covers for the chairpersons of all of our annual conference boards, agencies, committees, commissions, and for the full membership of the Committee on Nominations. Duane put all your people on notice, the Board of Laity and the equivalent bodies. But also one of the things I want to celebrate is that in the legislation, they strongly encourage that with the training that we provide a self-assessment tool. And one of the primary self-assessment tools that exist is IDI, the Intercultural Development Inventory, which is one of our priorities for anti-racism work here in Indiana. So celebrate yourself that we're already well on our way in the journey of IDI. We still have a lot more work to go. And now we're adding this cultural competency tool with it as well. One of the things that also happened around that was we added some language to our missional strategy. And I'm going to ask Duane and Nathan to chime in here about some of that language that we added around the eradication of racism. Make sure I'm getting this right. White supremacy, patriarchy, and colonialism. Talk to us about that, Duane and Nathan.
Yeah, Nathan, why don't you talk about kind of where that sat in the Church and Society 1 group, and then we can kind of add how this played out on the plenary floor later in the second week.
Absolutely. So the legislative committee that I was assigned to was Church and Society 1, and we were assigned a number of petitions that in some instances ran parallel to the revised social principles provided by the General Board of Church and Society. And so a number of petitions were referred back to them that were not originally provided by them to the General Conference. And the petitions that were referred to them were in this vein to amend the missional strategy And since since they were referred, they weren't acted upon on the floor of General Conference. And so later in the plenary sessions, Duane, you can touch on this, that to ensure that the missional strategy of the United Methodist Church going forward accounted for those specific iterations of missional need to eradicate racism, white supremacy, patriarchy, and colonialism. Action was taken on the floor of General Conference.
Yeah, I thought that was a really interesting window into the multiple ways that we sometimes enter into conversations about who we are and who we want to be as a worldwide church. And it occurred to me, and I'm not sure if, Lynn, this is the place to insert it, but I'll go ahead and add where this conversation came up in a different place. And so I was assigned to Church and Society 3. There were 3 groups that dealt with issues of the Church and Society, and Church and Society 3 is a new one this year. Typically there has only been 2, but because there was so much legislative material around this, that they added a 3rd group, and I happened to be assigned to that 3rd group, in which we discussed really global issues related to this. And so we had issues that dealt with communities of the world. There were some petitions around Israel and Palestine and Gaza, and there was petitions around the Korean Peninsula and peace and things like that. But there were also issues that we looked at from a global perspective. And so there was, and the reason why I feel like this is interesting and connected to this conversation around eradication of racism, white supremacy, patriarchy, and colonialism was that there was a petition that was in front of our group around being an anti-colonialist church. It was a resolution that, if it was passed and approved, would go into our book of resolutions. It didn't state anything other than a position. And it was very interesting because some of those things that we in the US are very comfortable talking about, ableism and homophobia and sexism, those were noted as some of the effects of colonialism and the things that we wanted to address. But there was one conversation in particular that I recall where, because we had people from all over the globe in our legislative conversations, I was the legislative chair of the 2 sub-chairs. So every legislative group has a chair, and then there were some sub-chairs to kind of break the work up. And I was nominated as a sub-chair leader. And we had some really challenging conversations around this colonialism petition that was in front of us, because some of our siblings from other places in the globe said that the language that we're using, we understand the principle, we support it, but the language doesn't really kind of have the same kind of meaning or context in our local church. In particular, there was a conversation with a pastor who served a church in the North Katanga Annual Conference in Africa, and I think his church, that one has, I believe there are 3 countries that are in that annual conference, and I believe that he was from Democratic Republic of Congo. And so we talked about it from that perspective, and we could have just kind of voted it through and kind of kept the very American language, but we took the time to kind of put it aside and then come back to it and talk about really what was helpful in keeping the spirit of it, but also making it applicable for the global church. And we ended up taking some of those language pieces out of it so that it had a much more neutral flavor to it, even while we spoke to the issue itself. And then it passed unanimously out of our subcommittee. And so I think that was really an important window into how a lot of conversations happened and how we can speak to this as a worldwide church.
Yes.
The part that I think we wanted to point to later is that, as Nathan had pointed out, that some of the petitions that came to Church and Society 1 were referred back to the general agency for them to kind of work with and kind of figure out how that fits with our global language around it. On the last day of our plenary, as we were discussing the budget, there was a budgetary category that was in front of us around our missional strategy. And it had 4 bullet points of priorities. And someone went to the mic. It was a pastor from the Eastern Pennsylvania Annual Conference. And I believe it was Reverend Lydia Munoz. And she made an amendment to add a fifth bullet point to those 4 missional priorities that were in that part of the budget. And it was to eradicate, we've been using those 4 words right here because that was what was added for the eradication of racism, white supremacy, patriarchy, and colonialism. And we were nearly out of time. We were running against the clock. We wanted to get the budget passed. We had set suspended rules, but that amendment to that particular piece of the budget passed with an 82% vote, and not a lot of discussion because there was nearly unanimous consent around that this should be a priority. And what's significant about that is not just by the percentage that it was passed, but that it went into the budget. And what we know is that when we fund something, then it really matters, because we can make resolutions, but if we don't put our, as they say, money where our mouth is, then whether it has an effectiveness, is sometimes not. So by the fact that we very strongly supported that, and through the commitment of funding for that, it really speaks to our commitments to those ideas.
Yes, definitely. Thank you. And we're going to kind of, because I think it's important for us to recognize that we made a lot of moves around these topics around racial justice. So we added this language to the missional strategy, but also one of the things we did was in Article 5 of the Book of Discipline, we expanded our understanding again of the definition of how we define racism, to include language like white supremacy, white privilege, and colonialism. And I think specifically the language says that fueled by white privilege, white supremacy, and colonialism, the sin of racism has been a destructive scourge on global society and throughout the history of our church. And so I think it's important that we've been paying attention in General Conference to all of these places that we needed to rethink our understanding of things as we become more aware of how it affects society. And I think that's the best phrase I can think of there, is literally our work with church and society and how we do that. Anything else before I pivot there?
I think we probably need to keep this moving. So yeah, why don't you, lots of
All right.
topics.
Well, one of the things I want to speak to again, that because I love I love reading like the small lines, that one of the things that in that same consent calendar of the day when we were removing a lot of the harmful language, one of the petitions that was in there was around youth being recommended to serve as district lay leaders or associate lay leaders. And it said that the General Conference recommends, that when there's not a youth elected to serve as a district lay leader, that they recommend that one of the associate district lay leaders be a young person. And so what do y'all just kind of weigh in there? What do you think that has an impact on us as around raising up leaders in our conference?
I think it's important to have a plethora of voices at the table, and one such voice is that of the young person. When I first ran back in 2019, I was fresh out of college, had a full head of hair, and was a young person. And I'm not as young as I once was, but the more young folk that we get to add their voice to meaningful discussions and be at tables where impactful things are happening, I think is incredible and will be a bright future of hope for the church. Young people involvement is it will be a high watermark for the future and longevity of the United Methodist Church as we continue to grow and evolve as a denomination. And that starts with young people being involved and having voice. And this is just one way to get those young persons and involved in the church. Just one way, and hopefully there will be many more encouragements in the years to come.
Couldn't agree more. Anyone else?
Mary-Kate, do you want to add something?
Well, I completely agree with Nathan. I think, well, two things. One, I think it's crucial that we have the voice of young people. There was it was talked about this idea of 7 generations being impacted by the legislation that we did. And that 7 generations obviously extends beyond where the young people are now, but that keeps them in the throes this entire time. I also think that it's important, just this idea that the world is constantly changing and shifting. It's fluid, right? And with that has to come this idea that the young people have an experience in life that the older generations just can't don't have, because it's just a different world that they're in. And while we don't love change, I don't think we take to change. Most people don't take to change very easily. Those young people are going to keep those good, positive changes at the forefront, and necessary changes, even with things as, well, I don't want to say as simple as, but things like the retirement plans for clergy have changed. Just this general conference changed the system of retirement and pension funds. And so while there's no age limit of when you can go to seminary and get ordained, if we want young people to be in there, they have to understand that renting houses is different, buying houses is different. The market out there is a very different space right now. Yes. And that voice, if nothing else, even just living wages and retirement and housing and things like that, really just kind of need a voice. But also the idea that we know with the COVID times, we saw how much went online. And while many people are back in the buildings, there's going to be an online presence that, of course, any age can be a part of, but it does seem that the young voice could have a grasp on that, just in new and different ways, because it's what they know. It's not always what they've had to learn. It's just what they've always known. And so I think that's great. And I think that the presence at General Conference of some dominant young voices was crucial. I think there are spaces where maybe young persons wouldn't have been heard as much had they not been willing to speak out and include those. And that is delegates who spoke out for things, as well as the young adult reports that were given, the message that was given by 2 young adults, which were fantastic.
Yep.
Yes, definitely. Definitely. So let me jump back, Duane, again to some of the things we talked about around justice and resources. One of the things that happened was an addition to paragraph 1302, which talked about providing training and resourcing and consultation for and with all levels of the church to actively resist intersecting structures of white supremacy, heterosexism, sexism, patriarchy, transphobia, xenophobia, ableism, colonialism, excuse me, and classism. Can you speak to that?
Yeah, I think that was a conversation that it was difficult to know where so many conversations were happening because of the hundreds of delegates that were there, and then as you noted, there was over 1,000 pieces of legislation that had to be worked through. But that concern, I think, broadly saturated pretty much everything that we talked about. Where do those conversations fit into our priorities, into our social principles, into our budget? And what I think feels a little bit like a new understanding is the intertwining. I think we often use the word intersectional justice. And this is an example and has components of that. But the intertwining of all these things and our concern about them in all parts of our ministry. And so the need to pay attention to them where I think in the past, perhaps we may have thought of categories as maybe a little bit simpler. You know, we would think about, say, for example, the status and role of women. We established a commission on that in the 1980s, or we thought about our concerns around racism, and not necessarily the same kind of broadness in some of these topics that include both patriarchy and white supremacy and white privilege, right? So we're looking at them in a much more nuanced way and in a much more intertwined way. And I think that we will continue to build and learn. So I don't think that we have figured anything out, but we have made a commitment to understanding the details and the complexities of some of these things. And it came out in all the legislative work that was done. So what that one gives me heart about where we are as a church. And also it gives us a little bit of more tools to work with in our local churches and in our annual conference in Indiana. So I think, you know, as we digest everything that has been completed at General Conference, we'll continue to kind of understand it and process it more in the multiple places where we have, you know, the choices to do this in the subcommittees of DMJ around, you know, creation, care of the earth, or around the committee and on the status and role of women on COSRO, and in places where we haven't before. So in our compassion and justice group, we work around, or our inclusion work, we've worked around disabilities, as MaryKate has already talked about, but we haven't really had a lot of robust conversations around the inclusion of LGBTQIA people because of some of the prohibitions and obstacles to that were baked into our system that now have been removed. So we've got just a lot more that's going to say that we're going to have to learn, and that we'll say about this and talk about. And that really just excites me. So I think this is more like a comma, because there's going to be a lot more to come.
Yes.
Very much.
And I love it. Again, you said it perfectly. I love that in expanding our definition of diversity, that now we can say without hindrance that means not only racial diversity and ethnic and cultural diversity and gender diversity, but also neurodiversity, and also people with differently able, but also the LGBT community, that we can look at what does it mean for our work as a church, regardless of where we stand theologically. What does it mean for our work to be the church that has open mind, open hearts, and open doors, that people can be loved on and cared for when they come to any one of our churches, conservative, progressive, down the middle, or anywhere else, that people understand that we have a heart for seeing them and a heart for diversity and growing in how we do ministry in that way. And so I know we talked about a lot of the legislation that passed. I want to talk just for a minute, and we're just going to hit two more things, and then I'm going to give us our wrap up. I want to talk just for a minute, Nathan, about one of the things that came up for discussion, but didn't necessarily pass, but has been an important conversation, and that's around national flags being political symbols in the churches and the separation of church and state.
Yeah, absolutely. So I touched earlier on certain legislation that ran parallel to concepts within the revised social principles, and the epidemic of Christian nationalism, particularly in the United States, is a matter that requires a great deal of concern and looking at to ensure that we can adequately address and ensure that there's a separation. And one of those key pieces of legislation, particularly in Church and Society One, like you said, was the removal of the national flags from sanctuaries and places of worship. And so what resulted from our legislative committee was that it was referred to the General Board of Church and Society for their continued work in revision and editing the revised social principles. And my understanding is that there's a Christian nationalism section of the revised social principles that was passed, and I would encourage to look at that for the stance on where the United Methodist Church stands on that.
Thank you. Thank you. It's going to be a continuing conversation, but one of the things we have to realize is that, again, what works for us doesn't work for everybody. And when someone is standing offering communion next to a flag, that it doesn't have the same positive significance for everyone as it does for others. And so, again, that's just another one of those conversations that we're going to keep having, and I hope we make some progress on. Duane, you mentioned that we had a lot of conversation around Palestine and Israel and Gaza. And one of the things that I do want to mention is that this was a heavy topic that was discussed in many facets at General Conference. And one of the results of that was that we have resolved to calling upon the UN Security Council to provide framework that brings conflict to a just and permanent end. I know people are on all sides of polarity as it relates to the conflict in Gaza. But we have taken a stand as a church, not only to pray for peace, but to call for the UN Security Council to work towards a framework that does bring peace and bring an end to conflict. And those letters of memorandum are being drafted now as a result of the work that was done there. Another thing that has happened is that we have readopted and reaffirmed our priorities around creation care. And so I want to celebrate again the work that you're doing here in Indiana. And so one of the things that the Board of Church and Society has presented to us is that we continue to affirm that it is necessary for each one of our conferences to have a caretakers of God's creation coordinator. And here in Indiana, we call that the Creation Care Alliance, and Pastor Rob Barton chairs that for us. But we also have a new Earth Keeper who has just been certified, Anita, and I'm going to lose her last name right now.
Stanford.
Stanford. Anita Stanford is one of our newest keepers. Sanford, excuse me.
Yes.
Earth Keepers in Indiana. And so we just want to affirm and celebrate that. If you have questions about how you can get involved with creation care and earth keeping, definitely reach out to us. Reach out to us about that. I'm going to give just a couple of closing exciting statements, but I want to ask you, is there anything else that you all want to mention as we get ready to wrap this conversation up?
You know, I would just like to maybe share one impression that I had leaving both throughout and then leaving General Conference, and that is that MaryKate and I both shared another conversation like this at a district level last week, and we both told the folks that were at that gathering what a generous spirit that we both felt in all of those things. And the word that was stuck in my mind as I was both entering and then throughout the time there and leaving was wholeness, the word wholeness. That I feel like we made every effort to be a church that celebrates the wholeness of people. And we see that so prominently in these conversations that we've just had tonight about the ways that we see people as whole, created in God's image and created by God's. And so creating spaces and structures and organizations that allow people to operate in the full wholeness of their selves, of their identities, and can fully affirm all the ways that they can be who God created them to be, is really something that's remarkable that we have, I think, accomplished or at least made giant strides towards in this General Conference. And so I just want to celebrate the wholeness of the work that we did and the wholeness of the celebration of people as a result of that good 2 weeks of work.
Yes, yes. Thank you. Mary-Kate, Nathan, any other words you want to share before we wrap up?
Mary-Kate, I can go and then
Sure.
you can. Okay. So like Mary-Kate and Duane, I was on a district Zoom 2 nights ago for the North District, and I will offer my same closing remarks that I offered there. That the sense of hope that I have for the future of the United Methodist Church is strong based on General Conference, but it's a hope that needs work to be done at the local church level. It's work that needs to be done at the local conference level. Is that we pass large pieces of legislation, but the work is yet to be done. The work of DMJ and the conference is yet to be done, and we need to encourage folks to continue the progress and evolution of the United Methodist Church here at the local level, because that's where the real work gets done in the lives of transforming the world. And so I would encourage folks to do the good work, to continue to do the good work. That would be my takeaway from General Conference and this conversation as well.
Thank you, Nathan. Mary-Kate?
Yeah, I love both of those comments or thoughts. There was such a great spirit coming out of there. We know that the United Methodist Church has been fractured in the last few years after the last General Conference, and lots of hard feelings and tough feelings, and just a lot of emotion coming out of the last few General Conferences in particular, that we didn't know what we were going to expect as far as unity and unitedness, right? There were a lot of tough conversations going on around human sexuality, around regionalization, around disaffiliations. And no one really knew exactly how it was going to go. And it felt like we came out with so much more. There were tough discussions that were had, and people were prepared to have those, and they were willing to have some of those, even though some of those really didn't even have to happen on plenary floor, because there was also this sense of unity in the legislative committees and thoughtfulness going into the petitions that people put in. There was revised social principles. And since the one I sat in was dealing with our place in society and took on a lot of this topic, the social community, there were a lot of other petitions that lined up side by side with the one that GBCS, the Church Global or General Board of Church and Society, came out with for their 2 paragraphs of the social community. That really just lined up. They didn't pass through because it was in preference to the one from GBCS, but just this unitedness that we came out of after a season of brokenness. To me, yes, what Nathan said, there's still a lot of healing to do, because there's still a lot of work to do at the local and conference levels. But literally we left there on the last morning doing a love train, right? An actual love train broke out. Not because we all agree on everything, not because everything was completed, not because everything was perfected, but because everything was just done in this spirit of togetherness, this spirit of opening things up and widening those circles and understanding what we have in front of us, the ability of the things we have in front of us to do, and the opportunity for us to do all of these things is now right there in front of us to do.
Yes, thank you so much. I think you said it best. One of the things we did here was we drew the circle wider. We've expanded our understanding of diversity. We have reaffirmed our intentions to continue the work towards justice and eradicating the sin of racism and colonialism. But it's just been a historic thing that we've done, also in removing harmful language, and really just working towards building a more beloved community. It was historical also, and I want to lift up a couple of these points and then we're going to be done, is that it was historical also in that Bishop Tracy Smith Malone became the first Black female president of the Council of Bishops. Bishop David Wilson became the first Native American bishop to preside over General Conference. Bishop Hector Burgos Nunez became the first bishop from the island of Puerto Rico to preside over plenary at General Conference. Bishop Carlo Rapanu became the first Filipino American bishop to preside over General Conference. Bishop Karen Oliveto became the first openly gay bishop to preside over General Conference. And our own Reverend Dr. Elise Fulbright became the first person of color to be elected as the Secretary Designate of the General Conference. It's hard to imagine that even in 2024 that this is the first time that many of those things have happened. But y'all, we have made history, and I believe that oil trickles down. And so I believe that that same work towards justice and expansion and drawing that circle wider is going to continue in our annual conference, in our districts, and our local churches. And much of it is going to happen because of people like each one of you, Duane, Nathan, and MaryKate, and so many others who are going to continue to raise the awareness that we have had much work to do. Much has been accomplished. Many of the ups and downs have been experienced, and we still have some more to go. But there is still great work to do, and God is not through with us yet. So friends, thank you so much. Thank you for taking time to listen to this conversation. Duane and MaryKate and Nathan, thank you so much, not only to you, but to all the delegates who went to represent us, to work on our behalf, but who just fought for justice and continued focus on building beloved community in the body of Christ and throughout the whole world. We're so grateful for you. We're grateful for what God is doing and what God has done. And we're hopeful for what God is going to do through the work of the Indiana Conference. Thank you, friends, and God bless you.
Thanks, Lynn.